our panel series, which we endeavored to put together after the spring 2020 issue of Inside Turkey entitled The Ordeal of the Century. I'm Dr. Ibrahim Efe, and I'll be moderating today's panel, which is being broadcast live on SETA YouTube channel and Inside Turkey's social media accounts. I'm really delighted that we are able to put this panel together, and a very big thank you to our panelists for sparing their time to share with you very important information and their insight about the topic today. We held our first online panel last month in May with Ran Greenstein and Ayn Lustig, and I believe today's online panel will be equally invigorating and fruitful. Today, we have two distinguished scholars writing on the conflict between Palestine and Israel, which has been at the center of world politics and the power struggle in the Middle East for more than 70 years now. On the Israeli government side, there's no question that Israel is dwelling in a relaxed situation, not only because of the declaration by President Trump about the movement of the embassy to Al-Quds, but also because of the great devastation that's taking place in the Middle East and overshadowing the consequences of the so-called peace process. Palestine, on the other hand, is struggling with an unprecedented economic crisis amid the novel coronavirus outbreak and Israeli occupation. Today's panel aims to bring together the views and voices of two intellectuals who propose refreshing approaches on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are honored to welcome Galia Golan and Berdal Aral. Before jumping into the presentations, let me give you a brief recap on how we will move forward. Each panelist will have 15 to 20 minutes to present their discussion, and the panel will end with a quick Q&A session. I would like to start with Galia Golan, who is a professor emerita of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she was chair of the political science department. Galia is the author of 10 books, most recently Israeli Peacemaking since 1967. She is co-editor of 2 additional books with Gilead Sher, Spoilers and Spoiling in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and with Walid Salim of Non-State Actors in the Middle East for Democracy and Peace. A member of the National Executive of Meretz since 1992, she is also a member of the editorial board of the Palestine-Israel Journal. She was a founder and leader of Peace Now recently, and when she joined the leadership of Combatants for Peace. She was a founder leader of the Jerusalem Link, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian venture for peace, as well as a leader of the International Women's Commission for a Just Israeli-Palestinian Peace. Dr. Golan has received many international prizes, both for her scholarly work and for her activisms. Now, I'd like to thank Galia for joining us today. I know that she is recuperating from a recent surgery, so I wish her a very speedy recovery. Unfortunately, Galia cannot hear us today. She will start her presentation soon, but I would like to kick her presentation with a question. Now, Galia, since the United Nations resolved to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, there have been various attempts as well as obstacles to resolve the conflict. In your article, you mentioned some psychological as well as more concrete barriers to peace between Palestine and Israel. Based on your article, could you please explain what these obstacles or barriers, as you may call it, are? The floor is yours, Galia.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I relate to the article that I wrote. I mentioned that there are some very basic, I think even fundamental obstacles to reaching accord with the Palestinians. One of them is that neither side sees the other side as deserving a state. The Israelis tend to see the Palestinians not as a people, but as part of the Arab world that began maybe to develop a national sense only in response to the Zionist movement and settlers coming in to the area. And the Palestinians tend to see Jews as people who belong to a religion, but they don't see Judaism as a nationality. So from this, basically each side sees no reason to talk about self-determination or statehood for the other side because neither one considers them a nation. And the other element of this, because this is an identity element, is this comes out, of course, in the negotiations, where you have this issue, each side trying to prove to the other one that not only is it a people and a nation with a right to self-determination, but it has an historic right, it was here first. And the Israeli approach in negotiations has been that not only do we have a right, and not only were we here, but we have an exclusive right. It's all ours. Even Yitzhak Rabin said that it's all ours, but we're willing to give up some of it. And so that's the bargaining, whereas the Palestinians generally say, look, we already made our compromise. We gave up a claim to all of Palestine, and we want a state only in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem is the capital. So both see it as an exclusive right, but the Palestinians in 1988 took this pragmatic position and said, okay, two states, you have Israel, we'll have a state only in the occupied territories since 67. So this is a very basic identity issue, but it's compounded by the psychological issues. And I don't mean only the years and years of conflict, but the Palestinians come with a very heavy burden or trauma from the Nakba, that is when the Jewish state was set up in 48, and even before that, the trauma of having the Jews, whether in a war or not in war, push Palestinians out. And of course, the creation of the refugee issue, but it's a trauma of the Nakba, which is not always understood or appreciated by Israelis. For the Israelis, the trauma, of course, is the Holocaust. It's not that they think the Palestinians created it, but this is a psychological burden that is carried by every Jew, certainly in Israel. It's often manipulated by the government, but it's very real. The feeling that the Palestinians, the Arabs, the world, they want to push us into the sea. So every issue, and there are real issues, of course, over refugees and settlements and borders and security, but with every issue, Jews in Israel tend to see the Holocaust and persecution and the fact that our legitimacy here is under threat. And this is how the conflict is approached. Whereas the Palestinians feel they've made this, what they call an historic compromise. They've given up their claim to 78% of the territory, and they took the practical step of saying, okay, two states. So that's pretty much, I think, these basic issues. And of course, you've got the real issues in negotiations, even beginning with these identity problems and psychological problems. And they're the issues of the refugees, whereas the Israeli position has been that, or at least the attitude has been, and I think this has been fed and manipulated by the government, the attitude has been that they want to flood us with Palestinian refugees who will outnumber us and drive us into the sea. And that's very real. That's a very real attitude in Israel. And the other issues, of course, the borders, well, that goes back to these identity issues and the idea that the land is all ours, but we're going to make a compromise. And the settlements that have been created since 1967, in which Israel has staked a claim that it may now even go further and try to make officially part of Israel. And the security issues, these are all very real issues. But I do want to add one thing. There has been an attempt by some Israeli leaders to face these issues, to face them very clearly. That, and by the way, I think the Palestinians have too. Abu Mazen and even Arafat in the past, but Abu Mazen very clearly on Israeli television has said, we don't want to change the character of the state of Israel, meaning we're not going to flood you with refugees. And the Arab Peace Initiative, which was adopted by the Arab League in 2002, talks about an agreed upon solution to the refugee issue. In other words, the PLO position, certainly in talks with Olmert in 2008 with Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, the Palestinian position was, we want Israeli recognition of its role in the creation of the issue of the Palestinian refugee problem, and then we can talk numbers. And that's been Abbas's position. And in the Abbas-Olmert talks, I actually began to talk numbers, with Abbas saying that any state that accepts the Palestinian refugees, whether it's Israel or a third state or the states where they are today, they must have the hosts agreement. And that's what the Arab Peace Initiative said, which I personally think is an opening to find a solution. Okay, you say in the Arab Peace Initiative it has to be an agreed upon resolution of the issue, which means nothing will be forced on Israel. Personally, I think that is a way forward. The settlements issue is conducted with the borders. And Israel in negotiation has tried to accommodate as many settlers as possible without having to withdraw many settlers by drawing a border in such a way that certain areas of Israel, uninhabited, would become swapped for these settlement areas. There's an issue of the swaps. Even the Arab Peace Initiative calls for swaps. And it is a question then of the territory itself and how much each side is willing to agree to in swaps. The security issue, which is uppermost for Israelis, legitimately or not, it is uppermost. And that issue was resolved between Olmert and Abu Mazen. It was really the only issue that they finalized in their talks. And that was an agreement to have a third force, an international force, NATO force, under the United States, on the Jordanian side of the border with the Palestinian state. This was agreed to by Jordan as well. So there was one successful effort at reaching a solution to that issue. So you have security of borders, you have settlements, you have refugees, and they're real issues. But we saw in the Olmert Abu Mazen talks that there were solutions, and it was a way to simply work towards them. The Arab Peace Initiative basically addresses these issues. But I must say that a very serious obstacle, unfortunately, is the right-wing government in Israel. And this right-wing government keeps being reelected. I personally think that the reason it's reelected is that the government plays on fears of the Arab world, fears of Palestinians, Iran. And so I think the public, which normally would probably be very centrist in its views, votes more to the right because it wants a strong government to face these security issues. As I said, I think this is manipulated a lot, but this is a very serious obstacle. We in Israel have to have a different government. At the moment, we have a Palestinian partner, even though my government says there is no partner. Abu Mazen, Abbas, is a partner. And if we had a government in Israel, which I think we had in the period of Rabin, we certainly had in the period of Olmert, a government that was willing to take the steps that were necessary to agree to a two-state solution, security guarantees from outside, and the various solutions to the very real issues of the core issues in the conflict. My bottom line basically is that I think all the obstacles not only can be overcome, but there are formulae out there, and there were even attempts, near successful attempts to overcome these issues, these obstacles. That's how I see it. I remain optimistic, but it depends entirely, almost entirely, on the Israeli electorate. And the Israeli electorate, as I said, is very often manipulated. The fears, the very real fears from the past are manipulated, and the elections keep turning out as they do. We're now facing the threat of annexation. It's very hard to know if the government will go that far. There's a lot of opposition, even majority opposition in Israel to annexation. But the real reason, I think, is the concern that annexation of part or all of the West Bank by Israel will bring sanctions, will bring international condemnation more than has occurred in the past. So I think Netanyahu is hesitating, although he may go ahead and annex or try to annex the so-called settlement blocks that most Israelis think that we should annex, where most of the settlers are living in areas very close to the 1967 Green Line. I think that's about it in terms of my summary of the obstacles. But I do want to add that for all the obstacles, including the psychological obstacles, there are solutions. What it takes is a political will. It takes a political will on both sides. And I think right now the issue is mainly getting to a political will on the Israeli side.
Thank you very much, Galia. Unfortunately, Galia cannot hear us, so let me type her my thanks. And next we will have Professor Berdal Aral from Medeniyet University. Let me introduce Professor Berdal Aral, to you. Professor Berdal Aral completed his PhD with a thesis titled Turkey and International Society from a Critical Legal Perspective in 1994 at the University of Glasgow. His main areas of interests, both in his scholarship and teaching, include international law and human rights. He has written 4 books in Turkish, namely The Right Self-Defense Under International Law in 1999, Collective Rights as Third-Generation Human Rights in 2010, From Global Security to Global Hegemony in 2016, and finally Perpetual Betrayal, the Palestinian Problem and International Law Under Imperialism's Shadow in 2019. He has also published articles both in English and Turkish on the aforementioned topics, as well as on international organizations, the search for integration in the Muslim world, and Turkish foreign policy. Professor Aral currently teaches at the International Relations Department of Istanbul Medeniyet University. Thank you again, Professor Berdal, for joining us. In your book, Professor Berdal, The Perpetual Betrayal, you are saying that without a viable solution to the problem of Palestine, the region will never find peace. And in one of your news interviews, you are metaphorically referring to the international indifference as the word playing the 3 monkeys. Now, I would like to ask you, what damage has the Israeli settlement policy wreaked on the situation, and what are the ramifications of the word's indifference to what's going on in Palestine? The floor is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the Palestinian issue and its ramifications internationally. Of course, there are different ways in which we can approach the Palestinian problem. One of them is the one that is the favorable, the popular way in which the international organizations are presenting the problem, and that is a 2-state solution based on territories occupied by Israel in 1967. The Galia Golan speech is based on that premise, basically that there should be a Palestinian state in the 1967 territories. And that she mentioned about the psychological barriers among the Jews of Israel concerning establishing peaceful solution to the Palestinians. This is one way of approaching it, but there are different other ways of approaching the problem, I think. And one of them is that you can see the problem from a colonial settler perspective. Is Palestine simply a case of territories occupied after 1967, or is it that the mandatory Palestine has been completely overtaken by a colonial settler population? But I'm not going to get into a discussion about which formulation is to be raised in this seminar. I rather prefer to discuss the legal Jewish settlement in the 1967 territories as an obstacle to to peace. So, I mean, I maintain my difference, but I am presuming that the main basis of this discussion is the proposition that there should be a Palestinian state in the 1967 territories. That means in the 22% of the mandatory Palestine. Okay, first of all, we have to mention the fact that Israeli occupation and then its claim to have, sovereignty in parts of the West Bank itself, it is illegal under international law because under the United Nations Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, states are prohibited from using force or even threatening to use force against other members of international society. They are prohibited from acting on the basis of using brute force. And Israel occupied 67 territories by force, as you well know, in the 1967 Six Days War, at which time Israel actually increased its territorial size threefold. So this fact has to be first understood. Not only the United Nations Charter, but also you could also mention the customary international law, which prohibited the acquisition of territory by force or the threat of force. And then we could also mention the 1970 Friend Relations Declaration, which explicitly states that states should not obtain territory by using force or threatening to use force. In 1974, again, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1974, definition of aggression. In that text, it is said that through aggression, states are prohibited from obtaining territory. So all these actions are illegal. And don't forget, all these resolutions, 1970 and 1974 resolutions, although United Nations General Assembly resolutions are not binding, nonetheless, they have been accepted by consensus, which indicates the degree of universal support for these principles. So Israel is basically a belligerent occupant in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I would say actually Eastern Quds. We say Quds, but for the sake of pragmatic, practicality, I would use the term Jerusalem, although I don't see it as Quds. So Israel is an occupying force, and occupation does not give any legal title. When we talk about the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and including, of course, East Jerusalem, we are not only referring to the illegal settlements, but we are also referring to other harassments, other abuses of international law, which include the following, for instance. One of them, of course, is the security zones. It's not only the settlements, but there are security zones, which actually comprise 20% of the entire West Bank. Roads and highways have been built as well in the area. There are lots of checkpoints and outposts, of course. Outposts, there are 300 outposts in the West Bank, in the area. We should also mention how the settlers actually frequently harass and sometimes attack and sometimes kill the indigenous inhabitants of the West Bank, the Palestinians. We should also mention how Israel actually economically exploit the Palestinians by seizing water resources, by capturing some fertile land, and of course, apart from that, demolishing buildings or allowing people to move into the property belonging to the Palestinians. We should also mention about the separation wall, which is being at the moment being built in the West Bank. It's going to be 770 kilometers altogether. At the moment, it's pending, and the majority of the wall has been complete. At present, it's 9 meters long, high, sorry. And when you look at the way in which it's being constructed, it actually stole 13% of the West Bank, 13%, and dislocating 200,000 people, Palestinians, in the area. And this is such a bizarre wall that it actually incorporated percent of all the illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank into Israel. It includes, in terms of population, 80, and East Jerusalem have been now incorporated into Israel. So these are the issues that we have from illegal settlements itself. But now I would like to continue my discussion with the illegal settlements themselves only. And then I will mention the ramifications of the Palestinian problem for the international society and for the reliability of international law, actually. Let me say that illegal settlements appear to be the most glaring, the most remarkable, visible, most defined symbol of Israeli disrespect of international law, because it's been criticized by everyone. Almost every actor in the world and every international organization have continuously condemned these illegal settlements and asked Israel to actually stop the building of these settlements. Even in many cases, American administration, even although it acts as the protector of the Zionist state, even the American administrations occasionally, American presidents, occasionally could criticize the Israeli actions and ask them to put a halt to these settlements. Let me also give some more concrete figures about the illegal settlements. There are at the moment totally 160 illegal settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. 160. Altogether, 700,000 Jewish settlers live in this area. And let me also say that when in 1993, the Oslo peace process, the so-called Oslo peace process began, as actually during this process, in 1993, the number of settlers in the West Bank were 268,000 people. And now, in spite of the fact that the Oslo peace process was the reigning process in the 1990s, which sought to allegedly bring peace between the two nations, actually Israel continued to build illegal settlements, which indicates that Israel has no intention really to make peace with the Palestinians, and it has no intention really to allow the founding of a Palestinian state. It's very clear. Illegal settlements are definitely against international law. First, of course, it's against human rights because you are, displacing one population with another population. It's against also the rules of occupation. As I said before, Israeli presence in this area is illegal under international law. Belligerent occupation under international law. According to the Geneva Convention, particularly Geneva Convention which deals with the status of civilians, it is prohibited for the occupying force power to, for instance, change the laws of the area, to use people as human shields, to economically exploit the area, to commit human rights abuses, to kidnap people, to replace them with other people. So in our case, according to the Geneva Convention, it is clearly said, and I am now quoting, it says that an occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. In other words, you cannot really try to change the democratic characteristic of an area which has been occupied, which is occupied by occupying states. It should maintain the existing democratic structure, apart from maintaining legal structure, legislative structure, and refraining from human rights violations, of course. But Israeli actions actually are breaching the Geneva Convention. Israel itself is party to the Geneva Convention as well. It's a binding convention. Conventions are under international law, binding. So according to the Geneva Convention, actually Israel should have demolished all these illegal settlements since it's actually constructed in the area since 1967. Secondly, let me also mention that in 2004, the International Court of Justice, which is also known as the World Court, the most significant court in the world today, it's one of the organs of the United Nations. International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion, it said that the wall separation was illegal under international law. It's against self-determination. It's a violation of the laws of war. It's against human rights, and that it has to be demolished, and that the Palestinians should be paid compensation for them. However, as we all know, Israel did not pay any attention, did not even show any signs of respect for this advisory opinion, which is, although it's not legally, technically speaking, not binding, it has political and moral force. And actually, it's moved into action by the United Nations General Assembly question, which indicates the opinion of the international society, basically. Let me also mention that in 2016, when the United Nations Security Council debated illegal settlements in the West Bank, and the Security Council, with 14 votes in favor and 1 vote abstention by the United States, it actually said in its decision, and I'm now quoting it, it said that the settlements constituted a flagrant violation of the international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Basically, the Security Council, even the United States, did not veto this resolution, which actually asked Israel to do away with these illegal settlements and to demolish them. And yet, Israel still continues to act in a way that disregards the rules of international law and the sensitivities of international society. Obviously, Israel, in my opinion, does not show any signs of, finding any solution to the problem. Let me mention some other obstacles to peace. For instance, one of them is first, of course, refugee problem. I mean, Golan has just mentioned how the Israelis are sensitive about population, but under international law, including Geneva Conventions, as well as many resolutions of the United Nations, refugees have a right to return to their country. Refugee rights are human rights. Any refugee that is forced to leave one's territory has a right to return. Fundamental human rights. So, I mean, all the Palestinian refugees have a right to return to Palestine. Whereas Galia is telling us that Israel has been never any solution that allows the return of Palestinians. In my opinion, this is not a solution. This is simply a position of a solution, a palliative solution on the Palestinians, basically. Israel does not respect United Nations General Assembly resolutions or the Security Council resolution. For instance, United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 194 in 1948. It said that all the refugees have a right to return. Security Council adopted in 1967 a resolution suggesting that all the refugees that left their countries, their homeland in 1967 war, have a right to return. Basically, 237, Resolution 237, basically. Israel has been engaged in state terrorism against them. It continues to harass them. It kidnaps people. It commits a military aggression against Palestinians. For instance, we could mention its offensives against Gaza, 2006, 2008, and 9, 2014. It committed all sorts of crimes you can imagine, war crimes, crimes against humanity, killing mostly civilians during this offensive. Gaza at the moment is on the brink of a total catastrophe, as you well know. Since 2006, it's been condemned to a siege, a total siege, which actually condemns the Palestinians into a slow death because they lack really the most fundamental needs, food, medicine. They cannot build their houses. Many of them have been damaged. And yet Israel continues that the siege, its blockade against the Gaza. So it continues destroying lands. It continues to threaten people. It continues during the coronavirus. Even it refused to allow the Palestinian prisoners to have treatment because they were in congested condition in prison. It did not allow that either. It's not concerned with human rights or international humanitarian law at all. So I mean, there are so many obstacles to peace, and these obstacles actually are basically related to Israel. This determination not to allow the existence of a Palestinian state. Israel wants the whole of Palestine for itself, basically. It doesn't want refugees. It doesn't want any viable states. All the solutions that they mentioned are palliative solutions based on islands, a Pakistan island which are disconnected, which has no army, which has no really sovereignty at all. So this is not a solution. Without Palestinian problem being resolved, I don't think there's going to be any, peace and stability in the Middle East or in the Muslim world or in the world, because without addressing the root causes of, grievances in the Muslim world and the Arab world and among the Palestinians, without trying to, address their right of self-determination, you cannot establish peace in the area. Because the Muslim world here, speaking marginally, the United Nations is working in the interest of the Western state or the Zionist side or those who collaborate. So long as we continue to face this dilemma about the Israeli, I think this grievance, this fury will continue to feel, instability in the area. So we have to address the problem. And finally, Galia Golan mentioned that one of the things that Israel is really intimidated about is international sanctions being imposed against Israel. I think that's one of the solutions to the problem, that the United Nations Security Council has to impose economic, diplomatic, and military sanctions against Israel. And obviously, I know that the Security Council is not going to do it because of the United States, basically. But there's another way, and I have written about that. And that is uniting for peace resolution. United Nations General Assembly has the authority, to pass a resolution that advises to impose economic sanctions, political sanctions, military sanctions against the Zionist state, against Israel. And it's possible to join it. And there have been examples of United Nations General Assembly resolutions being, supplied by states. Like I give you the example of Turkey. Turkey joined the Korea War in the 1950s by virtue of United Nations General Assembly resolutions based on United for Peace. So this is possible, and Israel is really anxious about it. We have to exert pressure on Israel because Israel is not going to make it. Israel thinks, and most of us believe, that Palestine, there's no way in which we can have, in their mind, there's no way in which the Palestinians can coexist peacefully as a state with them. So we have to exert pressure, and that's how the apartheid system in South Africa collapsed, through the joint struggle, both of the South African freedom strugglers, together with international institutions, in particular the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly, that the sanctions actually impose enormous pressure against South Africa, which eventually led to its dismantling. This has to be done with the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Berdal, and thanks again, Galia Golan, for your very refreshing and thought-provoking talks. Now the panel is going to stay around for a while for questions and answers. Unfortunately, Galia cannot hear us, so I'll ask her questions. I have already asked the questions to her. Let me read these questions for the audience. The first question is, what would be the most viable solution to the conflict given the current Israeli government's belligerent policies and the Trump administration's support for these policies? And the second question, again for Galia Golan, is how can the psychological obstacles can be overcome as long as Palestinians are kept in an open prison? Would you agree that the unwillingness of the Israeli government to treat Palestinians as equal citizens is a real psychological barrier? Now, Galia, you can answer the questions.
I'll try to answer both of the questions. The question about a viable solution in this period, I don't think there is any solution possible as long as Trump and Netanyahu are in power. Trump, it's not only Trump who supports the settlements, but everybody around him, his advisors, his lawyers, these are all people who support the settlement project. In other words, they come from the right wing in America, and they support the right wing in Israel. So I really don't see how any solution can come out of it. The so-called Trump plan is really nothing but an idea whereby the West Bank would be chopped up into enclaves. Most of them would be Israeli for the settlers. And I think the Palestinians would basically have, according to Trump's plan, autonomy, because under Trump's plan, Israel would have control of security in the whole area, would even have to approve immigration into the Palestinian state, which itself would just be a bunch of enclaves. It's a non-starter. I happen to think, by the way, as much as this Trump administration considers itself, quote, pro-Israeli, I think it's actually quite anti-Israeli, because without peace and resolution of the conflict, we're just condemned to more bloodshed and more wars. So I don't consider this the Trump position being particularly pro-Israel. But be that as it may, certainly Trump is giving backing, and has already in fact taken certain steps that give the Netanyahu government the green light to do pretty much whatever it wants to do, which is, by the way, one of the reasons that the civil society opposition here in Israel has been so active against annexation, and I think successfully so. By making a lot of noise, we have urged countries and politicians in the international arena to speak out. And I think that may actually be cautioning Netanyahu in his next steps. But the bottom line answer, what is a viable solution given Trump in Washington and the right-wing government in Israel? I don't see that there's any solution. There are options such as annexation, autonomy, continued occupation. None of these would be a solution. Now, about this psychological issue of Palestinians, I think it's safe to say that Israelis generally, not all of course, but generally view all Palestinians as the enemy. But there is a distinction between Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The conditions in which they live are totally beyond comparison. They are totally different. You have a population in the West Bank living under occupation. That's military control, curfews, arrests, searches. It's occupation. And this is entirely different from the situation inside Israel. Palestinian citizens of Israel are not fully equal. They're fully equal under law in many ways, but there have been only a few prime ministers who have tried to rectify the situation. Instead of treating Palestinian citizens of Israel as the enemy, but rather to provide equal budgets and equal treatment. So I think the situation is quite different. It's not the same thing. Yes, there is the psychological problem that Palestinians in general are viewed as the enemy. But we've seen from the Oslo period, we've seen from various polls, that can change. And it changed under Yitzhak Rabin, and it changed under Olmert. The polls indicate that Israelis would like to see a solution. They just don't believe the Palestinians are willing to agree. In other words, the idea that was stated by Barak in 2000 that there is no partner on the other side is totally accepted by most Israelis, the same way that I think most Palestinians believe there's no partner on the Israeli side. The answer, I'm afraid I keep going back to this, the answer is a different government in Israel. That's for the electorate in Israel to decide. Outside pressures can help. Certainly American pressure, if there were a different president in Washington. American pressure has helped in the past. Sometimes it's helped a great deal. European pressure can help, but I don't see that happening right now. We need strong positions from the Europeans. We certainly need strong positions from the Americans, but I'm not sure we're going to see that.
All right, thank you very much, Galia. Now we have two questions for Professor Berdal. Professor Berdal, how would you consider Muslim countries' treatment of the Palestinian problem? And another question, would illegal Israeli settlements be stopped in any way under international law? Floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Muslim countries, they only pay lip service to the Palestinian problem, unfortunately. In the beginning, in the 1940s, 1950s, at least Arab world concerned itself with the Palestinian problem, and tried to, find a way in which Palestinians could have their own state in the area. Gradually, they have withdrawn from this position, and although after 1967 war, they were hardened against Israel, and imposed lots of continued to impose sanctions against Israel, and yet gradually they came to a position in which they decided that they should not sacrifice themselves for the sake of the Palestinians. Actually, they retreated and they accepted the reality. They saw this as a reality of Israel, and they gradually came to accommodate themselves with Israel. First in the 1970s, Egypt did it, and gradually, especially from the early 1990s, we saw this trend towards accepting Israel as a fact by many other Arab states as well. And of course, lots of Muslim states had, cordial ties with Israel. I mean, not most of them, but some of them. And Turkey was one of them. Always had good relations from the beginning, from 1949. Turkey recognized Israel as a state, basically. So Muslim states from the 1990s, they saw the Oslo peace process, the so-called Oslo peace process, although it didn't bring any peace. Yet the Oslo peace process was for them a justification to really recognize that they couldn't do much about the Palestinian problem, that the problem should be resolved by the parties themselves with the assistance of the United Nations. And we have seen that it's not really producing any viable solution to the problem. Oslo is that, and the Palestinians have been left with only a very, very minimal control in their lives in the West Bank and Gaza. So what they do is they continue to pay lip service to two-state solution. But I really find it very fascinating how they can continue to say that they support the two-state solution, because Palestine is gradually being, evaporated. Palestine is going away, basically, through the annexation policies of the Zionist state, and the United States supporting this basically. So I think the way they treat the Palestinian problem is not acceptable. There's a big gap between administration and the people. People want a solution to the Palestinian problem, a just, lasting peace for the Palestinians. And yet, governments mostly they are not really. Most of them, although there are some exceptions, but most of them do not show any signs of real engagement with the Palestinian problem. They only provide some economic assistance. They condemn the Israeli aggression. They vote for Palestinian rights in the United Nations. But this is not enough. I mean, this doesn't produce any solution. You have to take action, basically. For the Islamic Cooperation Organization is really useless, basically. It doesn't really impose any pressure on Israel. So I am disappointed about their position. They are not sufficiently vocal. They are not sufficiently committed. So it's really disappointing for me. Other question, the second one, would illegal Israeli settlements be stopped anyway under international law? International exists, but it needs some actors which are committed to bring about the solution. United Nations Security Council is stifled by the American in particular. So United Nations General Assembly is not interested in taking robust resolutions against Israel, apart from condemnation or demanding or confirming the rights of the Palestinians. It's not enough. I mean, I suggest that there has to be comprehensive sanctions against Israel. So without that, it's not possible. Secondly, I also suggest that at least United Nations peacekeeping forces could be dispatched in Palestine in order to prevent Israeli aggression of the Palestinians. Don't forget, Palestine actually is a state. Palestine is a state, de jure. De facto, it's under occupation, Israeli occupation, which means that Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. So in a way, international society, in particular Muslim states, can actually provide also some assistance to the Palestinians against Israeli aggression and against illegal settlements, because this is against international, I have mentioned about that. Without that pressure, without really taking robust action, condemnations or protests are not going to bring us anywhere, basically. So I think the solution should be sought in sanctions by the Islamic Cooperation Organization, sanctions by the United Nations Assembly, by the African Union, non-aligned group of states, plus, of course, full support for Palestinian struggle against the Zionist state.
Thank you very much, Professor Berdal. Now we will have a final round of Q&A session for the last two questions, which are for both speakers. The first question is, how has the Hamas takeover of Gaza affected the chances for a Palestinian state? And the second question is, could a Hamas-Fatah unity government be a partner for peace? And I would like to start with Galia's answer.
One of the things that I didn't mention is that time is not on our side. And the strength of Hamas, I think, is one of the signs of this. The longer we go without a solution, and of course, in view of the past failures in negotiations, Hamas gains strength. And the split of the Palestinian leadership between the PLO under Abbas and Hamas just, of course, makes it easier, or at least provides still another argument on the other side, the right-wing Israeli side, that says there's no partner, they're split, and that facilitates the policies that we see at the present. The truth is, it's very hard to know, first of all, if there could even be a Hamas-Fatah reconciliation, and if there could be a peace agreement with such a reconciliation, because one of the issues standing between Fatah and Hamas is the idea of the two-state solution and the various agreements that the PLO was willing to make under Arafat and under Abbas with Israel. I have no idea if Hamas would go along with a two-state solution. So far, they are not willing to do so. The people in Gaza, where Hamas, of course, is strong, certainly would like to see a peace agreement. Whether Hamas would go against public opinion there or not, it's very hard to tell. Our concern, one of my concerns, is that Hamas may gain strength in the West Bank as well, as frustration there grows amongst the Palestinians. But the bottom line certainly would be that Hamas leadership, as it stands today, is not a willing partner, let's put it that way. It's PLO. The PLO took certain steps in 1988, entered negotiations with Israel under Arafat and then under Abbas, and that's where our hope lies. It would certainly help if there were a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. The question is much more, would Hamas be willing to accept the positions or the demands that Fatah makes? And if not, then I think it's safe to say that Hamas remains something of an obstacle, because it becomes easy for those in Washington or in Israel who say there's no one to talk to because the Palestinians are split and divided and Hamas is intransigent. It makes it much easier to make those arguments. So the bottom line is, time is not on our side. Hamas could gain in strength. It doesn't have a great deal of strength today. It's never passed the 30% strength in the West Bank. It probably has less. The strength for the two-state solutions, however, has been declining in both Israel and in the West Bank. And that's of great concern. And it's declining because there's this thought, the feeling on both sides that there's no partner and it's not going to happen. But I don't think that's the Fatah leadership position, the PLO leadership position. And it's also not the position of let's say, an alternative to the present Israeli government. But I keep coming back to the same thing. I don't know how long Abbas and Fatah can maintain their support for two states, the two-state solution. At what point they may just give up and say, let's go back to our previous positions, taking all of Palestine instead of acknowledging or according a right to Israel to exist. I don't know how long they can hold out that position. And I don't know how long it's going to be before we have an alternative elected here in Israel. But for those of us who see ourselves as pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, we're doing everything we can to change the electorate and change the situation in Israel.
All right, thank you very much, Galia, Professor Galia. Now we would like to hear Professor Berdal's answer to these two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Hamas takeover of Gaza is a very significant turning point in the history of Palestinians, because it's here that the Palestinians managed to establish self-government really in the area. The Hamas stance, I think, towards the Oslo peace process indicates that the process was not realistic and was based on, unilateral sacrifice part of the Palestinians, because the Oslo peace process did not really discuss the most fundamental issues that were essential for the self-determination of the Palestinians, like boundaries, Kudus, Jerusalem, illegal settlements, for instance. Refugees, they were basically adjourned by the impositions of the Israeli side. It wasn't, a way of, resolving the Palestinian problem. And the Hamas was not in favor of this process. And I think the Hamas, effectiveness in Gaza indicates that perhaps the way in which the Palestinians could manage to maintain their presence, political presence, is through struggle, through resistance. And Israel knows it. Israel doesn't want Gaza to be a success story. That's why it is demolishing all the, infrastructure. It tries to, turn their life into a disaster, basically. It's killing, attack all the time to show that it's not going to allow any viable Palestinian presence in the area. So in that sense, I think the Hamas approach indicates a lot. And in my opinion, not only in my opinion only, I mean, I have been to some conferences of the Palestinians on the future of Palestine, and they have agreed, recently, they have come to an agreement that two-state solution, this negotiation with the Israel is not really a way out. It's not a solution, because there's no way that Israel is going to give any concession to the Palestinians. Basically, they are playing with Palestinians, playing for time, and gradually they have annexed lots of parts of the West Bank and Jerusalem. So I've been told that the PLO and LPT, they have really they hardly have any credibility. They have hardly anything to say for the Palestinians. They did not do anything. PLO actually collaborated with Israelis and provided them with intelligence about the Palestinians. And they were mostly, not reliable in terms of the way they administered the West Bank and East Jerusalem. To me, I think the way forward is for the Palestinians to come together. Hamas and PLO they have to come together. And those high-ranking individuals, they have not. I think a new, breed of intellectuals, activists, and the professionals and grassroots, they have to take over now the leadership of the Palestinians. Hamas and Al-Fatah, they should have to be united in a long, term struggle against this occupying state based on self-determination, and it has to be also some, resistance. And I believe that without a strategy of resistance, there's no way we can maintain momentum for the existence of a Palestinian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Berdal. And now, with Berdal's answer, I would like to conclude our panel. Today, we have had some fruitful discussions regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I think, although there's no easy solution to the problem in the horizon, and as Galia has said, time is against us, we are going to discuss this issue further. And of course, if there is going to be any Palestine in the near future, we will need to bring more actors into the discussion, as Professor Berdal has mentioned. I mean, we need to vitalize the international community and international organizations to take some serious steps in this regard. But today's panel, I think, have sufficed to answer some of the important questions in our minds. So I would like to thank for our panelists for their contributions, and I'll simply say thank you also to everyone watching us via webcast all over the world. Please remember to follow us on Twitter at Inside Turkey, and please visit our website at insideturkey.com for further news about our events and publications.